UB Bulls fans, you want to have a chance to either celebrate, vent, or just enjoy more UB Bulls football and to talk about the game that was, well, you're in the right place. Bullseye Nation, the Buffalo Bulls postgame show. John Kruba is your host, and the postgame podcast is going to start right now. Good evening, everybody, and welcome into this edition of Bullseye Nation. I am John Kruba. And quite frankly, folks, right now sitting here with the UB Bulls at 0-3 after a tough but hard-fought loss today at Coastal Carolina, falling by a final count of 38-26. And you got to give UB a lot of credit. Yes, they lost the game, but the important thing is after suffering that embarrassing loss at home against Holy Cross, they were able to bounce back, and they gave Coastal Carolina, that was favored to win by double digits, they gave them their money's worth. They gave them all they could handle. UB did actually lead this game going into the fourth quarter, 19-17, but as we have seen time and time again over the first three games of the season, the UB Bulls continue to shoot themselves in the foot with costly mistakes and errors. And we saw that turn the game in the fourth quarter when Jamar Brown for Coastal Carolina, the Chanticleers, took a 21-yard fumble recovery all the way back just 45 seconds into the fourth quarter and gave Coastal Carolina the 24-19 edge, and they would not relinquish that the rest of the way. They would go on to the 38-26 victory. But remember, before that, UB had the lead 19-17 going into the fourth quarter, but the costly error comes back to bite Buffalo, and now UB sitting here at 0-3. But there is good news. First of all, we saw some good things overall come from this UB offense. Cole Snyder looked very good. The defense, for the most part, especially in the first half, was able to hold Coastal Carolina to just 14 points, and UB even led at the half 16-14. And the other important thing, UB has not played a MAC game yet this year, have not played the conference schedule, and that is so critical because that really determines how far you're going to go and whether you're going to appear in a bowl game. So even though they're 0-3, it really doesn't feel that way, even though we've watched the games and seen them lose, because remember, they haven't played any MAC conference games yet. But there are definitely things this UB team needs to clean up before we get to MAC play, which is going to start a week from today when the UB Bulls continue this road trip and head on to Ypsilanti, Michigan to take on the Eastern Michigan Eagles. And again, there are definitely things the UB Bulls are going to need to clean up in order to get a victory against an Eastern Michigan team that was very impressive today, as they were able to put up 30 points in their victory at Arizona State. So for UB, they'll have their work cut out for them as they open the MAC East play beginning next Saturday. Let's get to the stats in this one. Again, here is part of the postgame show. And for the UB Bulls, as far as the first downs go, they had 7 more than the Chanticleers, 27-20. They're actually pretty good on third down, 8 of 20 compared to 3 of 8 for Coastal Carolina. They were 3 of 5 on fourth down, 1 for 2 was the Chanticleers. As far as total yards, though, this does kind of tell the story in the game. Coastal Carolina had 504 yards. That's correct. You heard that right. Don't adjust your radio. They had 504 yards of total offense. Meanwhile, for the UB Bulls, they had 337 yards of offense. And the passing was relatively close, 283 to 278. For the Chanticleers, meanwhile, the rushing, the ground game is really where you see the discrepancy. Coastal Carolina had over 220 yards on the ground, 221. UB only had 59 yards the entire game out of their running backs. And I think it's pretty obvious that's going to be an area they need to fix. They're going to need a lot more out of their running game because the MAC has a lot of good, young, talented running backs. UB is going to need to put up a much bigger fight in the run game if they have to have success moving forward into conference play. As far as penalties, 5 for 50 for Coastal Carolina, 6 for 44 for UB. Turnovers, both teams had 4. Now for UB, it was 2 fumbles lost and 2 picks. For Coastal Carolina, they had 4 fumbles in this game. So that's something they're going to want to fix and clean up, because you have 4 fumbles where UB, they had a couple fumbles and also a couple of picks. And time of possession actually heavily favored your UB Bulls, 39:06 to 20:54. But in the end, just not enough. The mistakes the Bulls made, well, Coastal Carolina cashed them in. UB wasn't able to do quite the same thing when the Chanticleers made their mistakes, and that's another difference in this game, as Coastal Carolina has started out 3-0 and have won all 3 games at home so far to start the season. Rare that you get that many home games in a row to start the year, but give Coastal Carolina credit for taking advantage as they begin the season 3-0. Meanwhile, for UB, they dropped to 0-3 overall and 0-2 on the road, but as we said, their first conference game next week coming up at Eastern Michigan. So that should be a very, very exciting contest. And now, while we have a moment, let's get you some scores around the MAC. We will start with Toledo falling 77-21 at the hands of number 3 Ohio State. Tennessee beating Akron 63-6, and another one of those matchups that, if you've tuned in to the post game so far this year, you know just how much I love those types of matchups. But getting off that, Pittsburgh beating Western Michigan 34-13, Cincinnati over Miami of Ohio 38-17, Kent State lambasting Long Island University 63-10, Central Michigan shutting out Bucknell 41-0, Iowa State taking down Ohio 43-10. It was Ball State blanking Murray State 31-0. Vanderbilt 38-28. The game of the day in the MAC had to be Bowling Green going into Marshall, taking on that respectable team and taking them down on the road 34-31 in overtime. And Eastern Michigan, as we mentioned before, UB's next opponent, takes down Arizona State 30-21. And those are some scores and updates around the MAC. But now we want to talk about the loss that UB had a week prior to this, and that was against Holy Cross. And quite frankly, with all the good things we talked about, even in a defeat to Coastal Carolina, totally different story for the UB Bulls against Holy Cross. This was a team that you were heavily favored to beat. This was a team that plays in a league lower than you, and to have them come back and do that to you on your home field, this has to be a low point in the era for the UB Bulls, Maurice Lindquist era. Because again, you had 2 14-point leads. That's right, two touchdown leads in the second half, and you couldn't hold on to either one of them and fell 37-31 at the hands of the Holy Cross Crusaders. And, being at the game, first of all, shout out to the UB crowd. They were outstanding. They really brought the noise. Way to go, guys. You showed up to back your team, and you really came out in full force. There were some Holy Cross Crusader fans on the other side, but for the most part, it was a lot of blue and white jerseys, and the atmosphere was absolutely electric. So props to you guys for showing up, Bulls fans, and we're going to need you to continue to do that throughout the season. Remember, UB has 4 more home games following this one. But to the game itself, for UB, you go into halftime up 21-14, Cole Snyder looking good, and it seemed like the offense was in a good rhythm to keep going, and then the second half happened, and that's where things really began to fall apart for your UB Bulls. But also, let's not forget, UB also had a 14-0 lead to start this one in the second, and again, they just could not hold it. You could see the defense was giving up way too many big plays. And again, for Maurice Lindquist, he's coming over. He was with the Dallas Cowboys as a defensive line coach, defensive backs coach. And we have heard when they hired him that he had a lot of experience with defense, had a high pedigree. Well, he's got his work cut out for him. He has to figure out something with this defense. You know, you figured you give up a lot of points against Maryland because, again, the Terps are one of the best teams in the country. But this game against Holy Cross, against a team that was coming in from the FCS, which is a league below you, I'm sorry, you should not be giving up 37 points in a loss to them. And Lindquist is definitely going to have to figure some things out. And then, of course, we have to first get into how the game ended. The Hail Mary. And I think what made it worse was not only were you 4 seconds away from overtime, which I think had they made it to overtime, UB probably wins the game. But regardless of that, you had 4 seconds away. All you had to do was knock down a Hail Mary. And for whatever reason, not only do they give up the reception, but what made it even worse was that the throw was short of the end zone, but the wide receiver for Holy Cross, Jalen Coker, who you do have to give credit to, had a heck of a game tonight for the Crusaders, but he caught it outside the end zone. And then, for some reason, a couple of UB defensive backs came in and they tackled him backwards towards the goal line, which you don't do in a situation like that because the momentum dragged him across the goal line and into the end zone. So if UB would have come up with their defensive backs and made a straight on tackle, he doesn't get across the goal line. This game still goes to overtime. But because of the way it was handled defensively, even after Coker was able to reel in the catch, they end up getting the touchdown with the time winding off the clock, and just an absolutely heartbreaking, gut-wrenching loss for the UB Bulls. One that has to have this team reeling and starting to wonder what it is they're going to have to do to win a game, because offensively they had a pretty good game overall. They put their team in position, especially after Alex McNulty hits a 52-yard field goal with just 30 seconds left, as clutch as you can get to tie things up at 31, and then you give up that big play to end the game like that. And in all reality, for UB, all you can do right now is just shake your head. This one was a frustrating game. You know, like I said, this is why you got to give them credit for bouncing back against Coastal Carolina. But this performance the week before against Holy Cross is just, it's not going to cut it. Defensively, it's certainly not going to cut it. And then we have to get into the officiating. That was another thing that I noticed. As far as this game was totally one-sided. There were a ton of penalty flags against UB, but there were only a couple on Holy Cross, and the Crusaders definitely got away with a couple of penalties. So for sure, the NCAA needs to take a look at the officiating for this game, because this one, it was not good. It was embarrassing. And quite frankly, it was one of the most unprofessionally officiated games that I think I have seen in my years of watching football. That's how inconsistent and how porous this officiating in this game against Holy Cross was. And so, quite frankly, the officiating crew, shame on you guys tonight. You did not have a good game, and you clearly were one-sided. Just not a good night overall by the officials. But in spite of that, you have to continue playing, and I thought there was one particularly bizarre decision by Lindquist later in the game. So UB was driving the football as they were still trailing 31-28 at this point. They got the ball close to the Holy Cross 40, but instead of going for it, they decided to punt, and all that really served to do was allow Holy Cross to kill more time off the clock in the fourth quarter. Who knows? If you go for it and make it there, maybe you get a touchdown or another field goal. Maybe this entire result of this game changes. That is the one thing that you always get a little bit nervous of when you hire a defensive guy to become your head coach. Sometimes they have a tendency to be a little more conservative in crunch time with the offense, and I think that's what the case was here. I think the play there was to go for it. It was a tight game. You have to dare Holy Cross to try and beat you defensively there, because they were having a hard time stopping the tight end seams all game long. I think if you would have just went for a tight end seam across the middle, you could have split the secondary, and I think you could have had the Crusaders in a whole lot of trouble. But as it is, they did punt it away. I think that's one of the play calls that, I'm sorry, I don't agree with it given the time, given the situation. But in the end, if UB handles the Hail Mary correctly, none of this could matter. You could have tried to go to overtime. And I think, like I said, UB, when overtime is set up the way it is now, it could be a track meet. I always favor the home team in a situation like that. And that would have been the case there. But instead, UB now has to bounce back from this loss as well and try to get on a roll against the MAC East. As we said earlier in the show, the MAC East conference play begins next week. So while we have a moment here, we want to get you some stats from this game. And again, when it comes to the first downs, UB, that's one thing you've noticed in the first 3 weeks. They continue to move the sticks. They've had the advantage in first downs in all 3 of their losses. So if there's something good and a positive you want to take out for the UB Bulls, this might be one of them. 25 first downs compared to just 23 for Holy Cross. Third down efficiency, 6 of 14 for the Crusaders. For UB, they were exactly 50%, 6 of 12. Total yardage, 464 for the Bulls, 457 for Holy Cross. Passing, 305 to 238, also in favor of UB. Now, where they got hurt was in the rushing game. 219 yards for the Crusaders, 159 for the Bulls. Penalties, again, this is where, again, we see the referees and the officiating rear their ugly head. 4 penalties for 25 yards against Holy Cross, 10 for 91 against UB. And the amazing thing was that on the pass interference, UB was doing a lot of the same things Holy Cross was doing, but the Crusaders, for some reason, got the whistles put away on them. But for the UB Bulls, everything got caught. So, again, we've already mentioned that point about the officials. We'll stop there, but those are the stats in terms of the flags. 4 for 25 for Holy Cross, 10 for 91 for UB. Time of possession also in favor of visiting Holy Cross, 32:04 to 27:56 for the Bulls. So for UB, this is where they stand right now. They have yet to play a game in the MAC East, which is good news. And they're going to really need to get some things together and straightened up in time for the matchup at Eastern Michigan next week. And so now we will look ahead to the next game as part of the UB Bulls postgame show. And so for the Bulls, again, they go to Eastern Michigan. Now for the Eagles, they are coming off that big 30-21 victory at Arizona State. Overall in the season, Eastern Michigan has been looking pretty good. And so you know that UB is going to need to come out and find a way early to score, come out aggressive like you did against Holy Cross, and they have to clean up the mistakes. They were an absolute killer, especially in the loss against Coastal Carolina, and that would be the case again. And so for UB, they need to clean that up as they get set to head to Eastern Michigan to take on the Eagles. And so that is going to be the next matchup for your UB Bulls. And for the Bulls, another player to keep an eye on is going to be the running back Samson Evans. And boy, did he go off in the victory against Arizona State. 30 carries, forget this, 258 yards and a touchdown. So that is somebody that UB is definitely going to need to contain if they hope to come out on top against the Eastern Michigan next Saturday. And we'll have it for you on the UB Bulls Football Network. And so with that, that is going to wrap up this edition of the UB Bulls postgame show. For everybody here, my name is John Karuba. Thank you so much for listening tonight. Again, your final scores in these 2 games, UB falling to Coastal Carolina, and then also falling to Holy Cross. They fell to Holy Cross 37 31, and then it was 38-26 at the hands of Coastal Carolina. So until next Saturday, John Gruba signing off. Thank you for tuning in, and we will see you again next time on the UB Bulls Postgame Show. Good night, everybody, and go Bulls! Thank you for tuning in to this edition of Bullseye Nation, the official University of Buffalo Bulls postgame podcast. Tune in next week for another exciting installment involving all things Buffalo Bulls. Until then, thanks for listening, and we will see you again next time.